inundated with fear-filled statements of climate collapse. Young people have been told that the rest of us have all doomed their future for our profit. We must stop all carbon emissions to conform to a net zero policy. And then I remember high school science, and people exhale CO2. That's what we breathe out. Do they know this? Or is that the real agenda, reducing the population? As an economic issue, we're told we must eliminate fossil fuels, as if oil, gas, and coal are fossils from dead dinosaurs. We've invited a special guest into the Economic War Room, Dr. Kevin Beisner, founder, president, and national spokesperson of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. It's a network of Christian theologians, natural scientists, economists, and other scholars educating for biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the proclamation and defense of the gospel. He's written over 15 books, edited over 30, contributed to over 35, and published thousands of articles. Popular and scholarly, he's lectured at universities, seminaries, conferences, and churches in North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. He's testified as an expert witness on the ethics and economics of climate change and climate and energy policy before committees of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. Dr. Beisner, welcome to the Economic War Room.
Thank you very much.
Hey, we're going to use a bad, good, beautiful approach. We're going to start with bad and from the media's viewpoint, and then we'll go to good and we'll go to beautiful. We do the opposite of Clint Eastwood. He does the good, the bad, and the ugly. We do the bad, the good, and the beautiful. So let's start with the bad. You've studied climate change, you've studied stewardship of the earth from the media's view. Following the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what did they say is going wrong with the planet? What's their view?
Boy, it's great that you started off by saying from the media's view, because it's really important to distinguish between what the IPCC itself says and what the media say about the IPCC. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change under the United Nations, actually, if you look at their scientific assessment reports, there's an awful lot of really good science in there. You'll never find terms like crisis, existential threat, catastrophe, emergency. They're just not in there, unless they happen to be in the title of one of the references cited in one chapter or something. But the IPCC doesn't use that language and doesn't put out information that supports that language. That's very, very clear. That's mainstream science. Now, I have my disagreements. I think the IPCC tends to think that global warming is going to be more than it actually is likely to be. But that's a quibble, right? Where we get into the existential threat and crisis and emergency and language, that all comes not from the IPCC, but from the politicians who are with the UN and do the press conferences when they release the reports, particularly the summaries for policymakers, which are not by the scientists, they're by the government agencies, and then from the media. They're the ones who tell us, for instance, the way UN Secretary General Guterres put it, this is code red for humanity. You won't find that anywhere in the reports. So, but what the media are telling us is that we are facing devastation of the planet. We're facing something that actually has some people afraid that human beings are going to go extinct by the middle of this century. Or as AOC once put it, we only have 12 years to solve this problem or we're all dead. I mean, this is craziness. There is no scientific basis for statements like that. And unfortunately, too many politicians get their so-called science not from the scientific reports, but at best from the summaries for policymakers, more likely just from journalists' total misrepresentation of this stuff.
Well, we've got young people like Greta just running around the world and saying, you've doomed our future. We're all going to die. And if you're guilty, you're a murderer, and pointing things out like that, right? Young people are terrified of global warming.
Yeah, they sure are. And it's really sad because it is probably the least of all significant threats to us. Poverty is a far greater threat to human health and longevity than anything related to climate. If you have income comparable to, say, the bottom 10th of Americans, you can thrive in any climate from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Brazilian rainforest. If you're trying to live on the equivalent of about $2 a day, you can't thrive in the best tropical paradise. That's the result of poverty. And so if we overcome poverty, we can deal with whatever climate might bring to us in the future. The problem is that the policies being pushed to fight global warming are all policies that slow, stop, or reverse the conquest of poverty. That makes people more vulnerable, not less vulnerable, to climate problems. You know, we have reduced the rate of human mortality from natural disasters, climate disasters, weather disasters, by more than 98% over the last 100 years. And that's during the very time when supposedly we've got this devastating global warming going on. Well, that's craziness. We see that wealth enables people to protect themselves. Our concern should be far more about generating that wealth, lifting the other roughly 5.5 billion human beings who have not yet come out of poverty out of it so that they can join the rest of us.
Well, and that makes sense to me. I mean, if actual climate mortality is decreasing as wealth is increased despite CO2 in the atmosphere. But here's something I found. I found this in a PowerPoint you sent to me. Maurice Strong, Secretary General of the UN Conference on the Human Environment, first Executive Director of the UN Environment Program, Foundation Director of the World Economic Forum, discussing in 1992. And he said, what if a small group of world leaders were to conclude that the principal risk to the earth comes from the action of rich countries? And what the world is to survive, those rich countries would have to sign an agreement reducing their impact on the environment. Will they do it? The group's conclusion is no. The rich countries won't do it. They won't change. So in order to save the planet, the group decides isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse. Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? This group of world leaders form a secret society to bring about an economic collapse. Is that a true quote?
Absolutely, that is a true quote. And frankly, that is the attitude of all too much of the environmentalist movement around the world. They tend to be anti-human, pro-nature, rather than recognizing that God made human beings to have dominion over nature in order to enhance its fruitfulness, its beauty, and its safety to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors.
Wow. Well, we're going to have to take a break. When we come back, let's delve into the facts. We've talked about what the messaging has been. Let's take a hard look at what the facts really are. In uncertain times, finding stability in the economy can feel challenging. But what if you could navigate economic volatility while honoring your biblical values? At Timothy Plan, they believe this balance is possible. Timothy Plan filters its volatility-weighted ETFs and family of mutual funds through a biblical pro-life and pro-family lens, so you can see competitive returns and moral responsibility, helping you to weather the economic storms. With Timothy Plan, align your investments with your values while adapting to our ever-changing culture. Since 1994, Timothy Plan has been recognized leader in biblically responsible investing. Timothy Plan, your bridge between faith, finances, and the future. Visit timothyplan.com or call 1-800-TIM-PLAN or 1-800-846-7526. Investing includes risk, including possible loss of principal. Before investing, carefully consider a fund's investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses contained in the prospectus available at timothyplan.com. Here's a $10 bill. It's got the picture of Alexander Hamilton on the front of it. You know, it's kind of sad. When I was 10 years old, everything that I could buy for $1 now costs about $10. That's the cost of inflation. It's just paper. It's not backed by anything. You can't exchange it for gold and silver. You used to, but you can't do that anymore. And that's unfortunate. You know, pirates wouldn't accept this. Pirates, they wanted gold and silver. Patriots, the founders of this nation, also wanted gold and silver coin. In fact, they put a provision in the Constitution, 17 words, that said states could only make gold and silver coins tender within the states. That's why I wrote this new book, Pirate Money, Discovering the Founders' Hidden Plan for Economic Justice and Defeating the Great Reset. It will explain exactly the history of money and exactly why gold and silver coins can be made modern with new technology and a useful monetary system. PirateMoneyBook.com. Dr. Beisner, I've talked to a number of climate experts and you know, terrific people like Mark Morano and David Legates and others that have pointed out some of the nonsense. But you start from a little bit different perspective, and I really love it. You start with a view of stewardship. Certainly you understand science. Certainly you understand the facts and all of the details. But your purpose and motivation is a little bit different. You're here to be a good steward of the planet for God Almighty. Can you explain how that brought you into this?
Yeah, well, you know, as a Christian believer, I take Scripture seriously. Scripture tells me that God created humankind, male and female, in His image, and He blessed them, and He said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and everything that moves on the face of the earth." This is a Hebrew sort of a poetic structure there where this shows everything. Okay, human beings are supposed to have dominion over everything. Now, back in 1967, an environmentalist who was actually also a medieval historian, Lynn White, published an essay in Science magazine in which he blamed Judeo-Christian worldview for ecological devastation. And that got reprinted in dozens and dozens of anthologies in environmental science used all over the world. And he claimed that it's because of this verse, Christians and Jews interpreted as giving them total license to just abuse nature any way they wanted. Now, of course, you can go back through the whole history of pre-Christian rabbinic interpretation and post-Christ Christian interpretation of Genesis 1:28. You never find that. It's a complete caricature, right? But what we did at the Cornwall Alliance was we tried to figure out, okay, so what should this dominion look like? Granted that we're made in God's image, what did God's dominion look like? Well, He started with nothing and He got everything. He brought light out of darkness, life out of non-life, order out of chaos, greater order out of lesser order, great variety of life. That's what our dominion should look like. We can't bring anything out of nothing, but we can jolly well bring more and more out of less and less. And as we do that, we reflect God better and better. So we came to sort of summarize the idea of dominion as enhancing the fruitfulness and the beauty and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and to the benefit of our neighbors, so that we're fulfilling the two great commandments, to love God and to love neighbor. That's what we're supposed to do. And God has given us the minds and the hands to be able to do that. And that explains, by the way, theologically, why we're not running out of resources. Even at the same time that we're growing in population, we're not running out of resources. Resources are less scarce now than they were a couple hundred years ago because people make resources. As the late Julian Simon put it, the ultimate resource is the human mind. Made in God's image, connected to our hands, we make more and more out of less and less, and that's why the long-term inflation-adjusted cost of resources is downward, not upward. They're less scarce, not more, over time.
Well, and the notion of stewardship is that it doesn't belong to us, but we're responsible for it.
Right.
And that is a statement that we have to take care of our planet. It would be irresponsible to purposely destroy the environment. But helping people out of poverty is not destroying the environment. It is actually using the resources God's given us.
That's right. You know, in the parable of the talents, you have the master giving to one servant 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, and then the servants come back and they're to give an account for what they've done with these talents that they've been given. And one of them comes back and says, "Master, I knew that you were a hard man, reaping where you didn't sow. And so I just buried my talent in the ground." You know, the master condemned him. We're told that he was to be cast out into utter darkness. And that's God's judgment on those who refuse to multiply the resources that God has entrusted to us. I think about the Leave It in the Ground movement associated with Bill McKibben and 350.org, which insists we have to get back to 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They want to leave it in the ground, all the fossil fuels. That's exactly the thinking of that servant. That servant was the wrong one. The two who multiplied the master's investment in them, they're the ones who were told, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in a little. You'll be given rulership over much."
Now, I think it's really important that the statistics, the data bears up your perspective. One of the arguments that someone could make is they could say, well, aren't you just like one of those doctors in the 50s that told us that smoking cigarettes was good for you and that they were paid off by the tobacco companies? You're actually making a case, and it's coming out in your new book that's coming up, where you make the case statistically that the environment may be better off than it was, that people's longevity is better off than it was, that actually this dominion, taking and using the resources God's given us, has actually benefited not just the planet, but benefited human beings as well.
Absolutely. I'm still waiting for a check from ExxonMobil or some other big oil or gas or coal company. It's not coming. We're supported by just ordinary individuals. The Cornwall Alliance is a nonprofit, and people give money, and praise the Lord for that. We operate on a shoestring, but God has blessed us with a bunch of volunteer scholars who have contributed so much to what we've done. And what we're trying to do is to get people to understand that a biblical understanding of the creation itself and its creator and of mankind made in the image of the creator leads to a totally different attitude from what dominates most of the environmental movement. Most of that is rooted in either a secular humanist, atheist, materialist worldview, or an Eastern pantheist sort of a worldview. Either way, it fails to distinguish the creator from the creature. And as Paul warns in Romans 1, when you fail to acknowledge the creator-creature distinction, you begin to worship the creation instead of the creator, and then you're given over to a reprobate mind. Professing to be wise, you become a fool. And that's what we see in, unfortunately, so much of the environmentalist movement.
Well, we're going to need to take another break. When we come back, though, I want to dive into this. The difference in average temperature if we do everything they say versus what it would be if we just are good stewards. The difference in the economy if we do everything they say versus if we're just acting as good stewards. What it would cost to go to net zero. Can renewables replace carbon-based energy? Sort of a cost-benefit analysis of what if we follow their path or if we're just simply acting as good biblical stewards. Let's take a break and we'll come back and address those questions.
I'm Kevin Sorbo. When you spend money, you consider who you're buying from and the causes they support. If you don't, then you're likely supporting companies that are trying to destroy our country and take away our freedoms. Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative wireless provider. They're a cell phone company and a good one. They offer nationwide coverage on the best 4G and 5G networks along with 100% US-based customer support. But here's the deal. Patriot Mobile's mission has nothing to do with cell phones. They carry out their mission by giving back millions of dollars every year to Christian conservative causes that are actively engaged in the fight to save America. Voting is no longer enough to beat the woke. We have to band together, support like-minded companies, and vote with our dollars. That's how we win. Stop supporting companies that want to destroy America and join Patriot Mobile today by visiting patriotmobile.com or call 972-PATRIOT.
Dr. Beisner, let's play a quick game. With carbon, without carbon, all right? So with carbon or without carbon, what's the difference in the average temperature?
Well, not enough to shake a stick at, really. I mean, it's most likely that when we reach a doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere compared with before the Industrial Revolution, we'll have raised global average temperature by something on the order of 2 degrees Celsius. That's actually good because we're coming out of the little ice age. It was really, really tough. Cold kills about 20 times as many people per day as heat waves do. But that's good. For the second doubling, we'd have to go from 560 parts per million to 1,120 parts per million. It would take probably a good 1,000 years to do that. And it would have no more influence on temperature than the first doubling did, because CO2's influence on temperature is what's called logarithmic. There are technical reasons for why that's so, but we probably don't have time to go into those.
Well, the whole notion is we're talking about a difference from pre-industrial age to where we're headed. 2 degrees, is that what you just said, basically?
Yeah, right, about 2 degrees Celsius, which, by the way, is a small fraction of the typical difference between nighttime low and daytime high in most places, and a much, much smaller fraction of the difference between summer high and winter low in most locations around the world. We deal with temperature changes like that all the time. Global average temperature is, in many ways, a nonsense, an inconsequential factoid, because nobody experiences global average temperature. The temperature that's important is where you are. Oh. And that goes up and down by far greater amounts than 2 or 3 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so we've barely moved the temperature, if at all. It's hard to measure and hard to know, but it's not consequential. But now I'm looking at 2 charts that you put out: global fossil fuel consumption and life expectancy. How are those correlated?
Almost perfectly. The more we use fossil fuels, the higher human life expectancy is. And the reason for that is that fossil fuels provide, at this point, roughly 85% of all the energy that human beings consume every year. Now, energy, you remember from your early science education in middle school, energy is the capacity to do work. Well, work is important to everything that we consume: food, clothing, shelter, everything else. The more work you can get done, the more of all those things you can have. All of those things contribute to human health and to human long life. So where we get our energy from is critically important, and fossil fuels are such a great source because they're very, very high density at point of origin. So you don't have to do as much refining and whatnot in order to get them to the kind of density that's really useful for work. They're thousands of times denser than wind and solar, which is why the idea that we're going to replace those with wind and solar is basically an idea that means, oh yeah, we're going to push people back into poverty.
You know, I heard an example of how we can solve 2 problems at once. A suggestion is, why don't we put solar all along the border? And if we put solar all along the border, and I think it was like a mile thick, we might get enough energy to replace coal, oil, and natural gas in the electric supply. And then it would be impossible but what a waste of land and what a use of resources. You've got another graphic that I think is incredible. It would take 2 Californias. Explain that.
Yeah. In order to provide all the electricity that the United States currently uses every year, that doesn't mean that we've added electric vehicles all over the place, just what we currently use, we would have to cover a total amount of land equivalent to twice the land of the state of California with wind turbines.
Well, and vast amounts of money. You can't build all those wind farms, yeah. Vast amounts of resources. You would be involving slave labor in China. You would be digging up and harming the environment in so many areas. Yes. So here, his cost-benefit analysis, I look at the Paris Climate Agreement, the cost of $1 to $2 trillion per year from 2030 to 2100 would be $70 to $140 trillion, and yet you've stated here it would have virtually no significant effect on human welfare or other ecosystem, except we would have $140 trillion less that we could spend to help people around the planet.
Yeah, and the impact on global average temperature, by the way, by 2100, of spending $70 to $140 trillion to try to reduce it, would be, we might bring temperature down by 0.3 of a degree Fahrenheit. All it does is chew up all those trillions of dollars.
Okay, now let's jump to another study, separate study, I understand, but another study basically said that, that if you reduce the temperature by a certain amount, that you will benefit the gross world per capita, gross world product per capita. And I think the number here was like $3,200. So it doesn't seem to me that you're going to be benefiting very much from all this, and it's going to be costing us a fortune.
Yeah, essentially what can be calculated from the IPCC's own data and theory is that in 2022, we had GWP per capita worldwide of about $14,000. Assuming 3.1% annual GWP growth, which has been normal for about the last century, that would rise to $124,000 in 2100. Now, the IPCC estimates in a 2018 report that if we didn't do anything to try to fight climate change, that climate change would take about 2.6% off of that, reducing us from $124,000 per capita to $121,000 per capita. Now, do you really think that a 2.6% reduction, taking us from almost 9 times our current GDP per capita to a little over 8 times our current GDP per capita, do you think that's worth it? I don't. Doesn't surprise me that the author of The Art of the Deal thought the Paris Climate Agreement was not a good idea. No,
it's not a good idea. Thank you so much for taking time with us today. Hey, you can learn more about Dr. Beisner, and he's got a new book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism, that's edited both by he and our former guest, David Legates. It's scheduled for release in late 2023, and you can learn more at the Cornwall Alliance at www.cornwallalliance.org. Look, we are in the economic war room, and we're fighting an economic battle, and climate change is clearly one of those economic battle things. We're going to take all of this that we've done, summarize it, and put it in our free economic battle plan. You can get a copy at EconomicWarRoom.com. Remember, what we see as a marketplace, our enemies view as a battle space. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.